Okay, welcome back to part two of our lecture on becoming a law enforcement professional. So we had finished up, and if you remember, we talked quite a bit about some of the challenges to the profession as it relates to recruiting, a lot of the different characteristics in becoming a law enforcement officer, and what citizens really might want us to be. We talked about recruiting for diversity, and so we've covered a lot of the different bases, including challenges, etc. But now we want to talk a little bit about the process for getting in, right? So a person wanting to become a police officer must, usually go through several steps in this process. It's often referred to as a multiple hurdle procedure, but it's different from, agency to agency with a lot of similarities. But I wanted to walk through the process to kind of show you each step individually. And then we'll talk about each one briefly as we kind of move on through the lecture. So again, the multiple hurdle procedure or the selection process, and a lot of departments have this on their websites. It'll tell you exactly what you need to do, and it'll even tell you on the physical fitness test what that test consists of. So you know exactly maybe if it's a mile run, how fast do I have to do that in? Is it a cumulative point total, or is each event going to be looked at individually, etc.? So a lot of things to consider, right? So let's kind of walk through the process. The first would be the formal application. So usually a police officer candidate, if you will, completes a formal application, which is shorter than your background investigation or application, but they kind of overlap a little bit. But usually it's the application up front, which is going to include things maybe like, your personal information, your job history. It could have your driving record. It could even talk a little bit about any criminal record, visual acuity, physical, emotional, mental condition, education, etc. And some police agencies and civil service commissions accept applications even when there's no opening listed. So if you find a department, it may just basically, you submit your application and it will hold it until something becomes open. And then when it's open, they will send you information on how to apply. So the first, kind of hurdle, if you will, is going to be that formal application process. And again, a lot of times there may not be an opening. They'll kind of stack all the applications, and when there is an opening for a test, etc., they'll send it to you. Or some departments won't take applications unless they're actually hiring. So it just kind of depends. Number two would be the written exam. And, some organizations use a civil service or designated department exam. It just depends. And it tests things like spelling, grammar, in some cases, mathematical ability. Not a lot of math, but sometimes there is some on an examination. These tests may also focus on reasoning ability, problem solving, reading comprehension, interpersonal skills, or the ability to process information. And typically, their primary function is to screen those individuals who might lack what they call the basic material to become police officers. So written exams are usually multiple choice type format, and they last a couple of hours. And again, they may test spelling, grammar, math. They may also test reasoning, problem solving, etc. Now, increasingly, departments are looking at how well an applicant can write. And although report writing skills can be taught, and they do teach you that in the academy a little bit, and they teach you even more when you get out of the academy and you get on training, it does take time to develop and master. So understand, if writing isn't your best thing, it's okay. You can improve and get better. But an individual who already possesses strong written communication skills can really help that person doing the hiring decide between, let's say, a couple of equally matched or qualified individuals, and maybe those other individuals don't have the same writing skill that you do. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, critics also claim that written exams really can't measure common sense and penalize those who don't test well. And such tests may also inadvertently weed out candidates who possess other valuable skills that really can't be measured on paper. And another downside would be, maybe those that English may not be their first or their primary language, right? So, again, most written examinations, they're kind of a straight pass-fail situation, serving just as an entry point into the next phase of the selection process. Some agencies, however, may factor the score on this examination into their final decision. So again, it's kind of agency by agency. So it could be, say 30 points for your written, 30 points for your writing, and then maybe 40 points for your physical agility and all the other stuff. So it could be a factoring of scores. But typically that written exam is kind of the first step, if you will. Next would be the physical fitness test. In police departments, most of them require a physical fitness test, of their applicants. And physical fitness tests evaluate a person's coordination, speed, strength, and ascertain whether the candidate is in good physical condition. And this type of test might vary from police agencies throughout the country, but the most common physical fitness tests are similar to kind of a military, obstacle course that must be completed within a designated time. A candidate may also be required to run a designated number of yards, and while doing so, maybe jump over a hurdle or a 3-foot barrier, or crawl under something, or climb over a 4-foot or even a 6-foot wall with both hands on the top of the wall, and then sprint the remaining distance. Again, all within a designated time, monitored by someone from that training division or another officer. So these tests vary, and we'll talk a little bit more about the individualized tests as we go a little further. And hopefully you were able, again, when you went into the introduction, you saw perhaps, or if it's in the discussion area, the physical fitness tests that were given by LAPD, or at the beginning of this lecture, the 2 links to the Sheriff's Department that go over each one of the PT tests. So, and again, if you log on to these agencies' websites, they will tell you what they are. Now, most agencies use one of 2 types of tests. The physical qualifications test, or kind of a PQT, or the job standards test, which might be what they call a JST, with some agencies using a combination of the 2. Sometimes it might even be a PFQ, and I know there's all these kind of acronyms, if you will, but just note that a lot of them have, it's going to be maybe a short kind of obstacle course, and then maybe separately jumping over a wall. Then it might be sit-ups, it might be push-ups, and then it might be a mile run. And that's typically what you see in a lot of different organizations. Again, to test those different things that I talked about, your coordination, your speed, your strength, and whether you're actually in good physical condition. So that would be your PT test. Next would be psychological tests to determine if someone is emotionally suited for a career in law enforcement. Employers use psychological tests to learn about the applicant's present state of mind, what's important to them, how the person is likely to respond to certain stimuli or certain scenarios, etc. And psychological tests commonly used during the selection include what they call the MMPI, which is basically the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and they call it MMPI for short, okay, or the CPI. So a couple of different tests that are typically used, but a lot of them in California are going to be the MMPI, and they do take a few hours to complete, but again, they're there to determine if you are ready, emotionally suited for a career in law enforcement. Then what would be the background? And the background is really a super critical factor And the background investigation serves two purposes. The first, to examine and verify your work history and educational record, and then number two, to determine if anything in your background might make you unsuitable for law enforcement. Okay, and background checks of potential employees is a necessary element in establishing due diligence for an agency's hiring process. And due diligence is defined as the care, caution, or attention expected from and exercised by a reasonable person under the circumstances to avoid harm of other persons or their property to satisfy a legal requirement. So remember that, that failure to perform due diligence can fall into that. Remember that term, negligent hiring, right? So if we go back for just a quick second and we look at some of those things we talked about, let's see, I think I missed it. Here it is. Negligent hiring. That's why we do the background. Okay, so I want you to understand there's a reason for the background. And yes, it's long and it's demanding, but it's a verification of all of the information on the application and your PHS, or what we call a personal history statement. I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. It's going to verify your driving record. It's going to be, you're going to submit fingerprints for a criminal record. Okay, and then it's going to look up your military record. So again, candidates are fingerprinted. The prints are sent to the FBI to determine if the person has a criminal record, and it's going to be checked for your driving record and everything else. Okay, now again, don't panic. Most states have passed laws making it difficult for someone that's been convicted of a felony to get employment in policing. However, if that felony has been reduced to a misdemeanor, then there's still the possibility for you to be successful. Many states allow persons with minor misdemeanor convictions to become police officers. So it's not impossible if you just push forward and do the best you can when you submit your application, and of course be super honest with that. Now, to kind of just show you what a personal history statement looks like, so here's one just to kind of give you a quick look, and it's long, but it's important that I show you, and this is on the Post website. It's also posted in and Post is the Peace Officer Standards and Training, so it's kind of the governing body of law enforcement for California, and it shows you the instructions to fill out, and these things are all on kind of fillable format. And you can see here's your personal information, relatives and references, and you can see it's very detailed, and I told you it was, so I just want you to understand what you're getting into. And there's a lot of room because they're going to talk to all of these people, verifying your education, right, all the way through. Okay, and then it goes into where you've lived, so your residence history. And we're only on page 9 of 27, but they give you a lot of places. And if you answer yes to something, it gives you a place to basically talk about it, right? Your employment and what happened at your employment, between jobs, leave of absence, you were a student, everything else. So there's your experience and employment. And then it talks about here, have you ever been fired from a job? But it gives you a chance to explain why. If you answered yes to any of these, then you say basically why. Okay. And as we kind of keep on going, because the application, like I told you, is long. Now, this is your background. It's not your application for employment is typically shorter than this. It's usually only a couple of pages. Here it talks about your finances. So you're going to have to disclose a bunch of things. Any legal things that you've encountered, right? Arrests, convictions, or anything like that. And there's yes or no questions, etc. Criminal acts, it talks about, arrests, etc. So you can see there's a lot of room for answers and things in here. And then there's your drug history. Yes, they can ask you about your drug history. So you just kind of go through here. Motor vehicle information, your driver's license, accidents, etc. Kind of going on. And then other topics, it kind of ends there. So you can see how long this is. It's 27 total pages. Now, I don't want to scare you, But I just want you to know that that background is very, very important because that background verifies a lot of the information that you told the investigator and what was put on your initial application. So not only does the background do these 4 things that we talked about, but it helps the investigators because they're going to do interviews with your references, your friends, your past employers, your neighbors, check on financial status, any pending litigation, your past job performance. Again, and it's all due diligence. Remember the negligent hiring thing that we talked about. That's why this is there. It's not there to just kind of pick on people. It's there because if we don't do our due diligence, we could end up in that negligent hiring aspect. Okay, then you're going to run into the interview. It's part of the selection process. And they are done to evaluate your appearance, your alertness, your ability to communicate, your social adaptability, judgment, emotional stability, and your interest in the job and suitability. It usually consists of maybe 3 to 5 interviewers. It depends on the department, okay, because some departments do it differently. It could be officers from the department, even community members, or others, but typically for an entry-level person, it's going to be in-house individuals. And they're going to ask you questions. It's going to be kind of it could be a structured interview, or it could be unstructured. And basically, they're kind of designed to elicit answers that reveal your personality and your suitability for police work. Okay, not really technical knowledge because you're not there yet. You're not an officer, so you're not going to have a lot of technical savvy, right? So questions could be like these. Why do you want to become a police officer? What have you done to prepare yourself? What are your strengths and weaknesses? And you better have a weakness. What do you know about, the department you're applying for and the community? What are some of the most important traits for a police officer to have? Why are you the best candidate? So these are questions that are interesting, right? And they should make you think, but start thinking about them now. So super, super important. And then they have questions that, they'll ask you that could be like, do you have anything in your past that could disqualify you for the position? And then maybe even a question called, do you have any skeletons in your closet? Meaning, are there things that you don't want us to know about that you want to bring forward right now? So all of these are important, and I really suggest that you start to kind of hone your skills on how to answer some of these different questions, on why you want to be in law enforcement. What have you done to prepare yourself? Have you gone to school? Have you taken some AJ classes? Have you done some internships, volunteering, etc.? What are your strengths and weaknesses? Well, and I know it's tough, everyone, to list a weakness. But the weakness could be something like, my verbal communication is great. My writing skills are good, but they could be better. So maybe that could be your weakness. And again, it could be the other way around. Or I need to go to school. I've done a lot of other prep and things like that and research and this and that. And I have all these strengths, but one of my weaknesses is that I need to focus and go back to school. But you're going to have to be able to list a weakness. So start thinking now on what that might be. Research your department. Know what it is that the issues of the organization, or know about the department, how big it is, who's the chief, who are the council people, how many officers, what kind of units or divisions do they have. You should know this stuff if you're going to apply there. And why are you better than everybody else? That's a tough question. What makes you the best candidate? So think about all of these questions, okay? And sometimes organizations may have what they call an assessment center. And this could be a video-based simulation or a scenario. Hey, they explain the scenario and they want you to finish the scenario. And the reason for this is to maybe evaluate your judgment, your decision-making, your physical reflexes. Okay. Also, in the different hurdles of testing will be the medical exam. Requirements vary from state to state again. and sometimes from department to department, but typically things like vision, hearing, cardio, those are things that are going to be kind of evaluated at the medical exam. Drug use, that's going to be at the medical exam. You're going to have to take a drug test, and yes, they can test you for this, and yes, they can ask you about it. So just be honest. I just want to kind of throw this out there. Years and years ago, if you had done any type of illicit drug, you would be basically eliminated immediately. However, things have changed over the last decade, and high school marijuana use and things like that are quite a bit more acceptable now. But again, it's from agency to agency, okay? The polygraph. This is typically used to corroborate information on the application or criminal activity. Maybe you said that you had never been arrested before, and the polygraph is going to verify your response to that. So while we know that polygraphs aren't admissible in court, they are used in acceptable procedure for pre-employment. So kind of keep that in mind. If you've never seen a polygraph, there's a little link to a YouTube video. You can watch a polygraph, and it can be a little bit stressful, but most of the polygraphers are there to help you. Now typically what they do is they do a written polygraph first, which means the same questions they're going to ask you when you're all hooked up to all the machine stuff will be the same questions that you're going to answer on a written format first, and you'll discuss it with your polygrapher before you actually do the polygraph test. So it's made to kind of put you at ease, and there's no surprises in the questions, etc. Okay, so again, part of the selection process, the critical tasks when it comes to PT, walking, running up and down stairs, jumping, lifting, these are important things. The 6-foot wall typically a lot of times is the barrier for a lot of applicants. Sometimes they have two. They have a 6-foot chain link fence, which is going to be a little bit easier. So you can see right here, because you can stick your toe kind of into the fence a little bit. The wall's a little bit different. But a lot of these academies will allow you to go down and test yourself going over the 6-foot wall, and there are ways to do it. So what about then education? So now that we've kind of walked through a lot of the steps, how much should an officer have? Are street smarts better than book smarts? It's been a long history of controversy. Some, chiefs and law enforcement executives think that you should have way more college, and some think that you should just be, kind of more street smart. So again, it's kind of back and forth. But now most require a minimum of a high school education or equivalent. Some require some college. So it could be 60 units from a, community college, etc. And some require a 2-year degree and some a 4-year degree. It just kind of depends. And many are going to require some college or a degree for a promotion. So if you want to make it to, let's say, a captain or a lieutenant, you're going to have a bachelor's degree. For sergeant, you might have to have an associate's degree. So these are things that are changing. Residency requirements, they don't have quite as much as they used to. Over the past few years, agencies have basically waived this residency requirement to get better candidates. These requirements were kind of commonplace back in the 70s. And although residency, again, is not typically required now, a lot of cities are beginning to accept those, or only those who reside within their boundaries. But let me tell you, most departments really don't have the residency requirement that they used to have. So just to give you a little bit of information quickly about POST. This is the Commission on Post. It's Peace Officer Standards and Training, and you can go to their homepage right here on this link, and it looks like this. And there's a lot of different resources: hiring, training, how to get certificates, forms to fill out, etc. And again, this is the kind of the governing body of law enforcement for California. Different states might have a commission. I believe Arizona has a post commission. Nevada has a post commission, and California has one. So there's different certification levels, but that's post. Typically, the police academy in California It could be a little bit more now, and I believe it has gone up to maybe 960 or so, maybe even 980. But the police academy is right around 920 hours of instructions. It might be a little bit more. Extending over a 23-week period, it might be a little bit more. And all students must successfully complete all phases of that training program. And again, you can go here to the San Bernardino County Sheriff as an example. You can click on this link, it'll take you there. And it's actually a college class. So you could sign up for the police academy as a college course. The basic academy, again, it's full-time, so a lot of people don't work when they go through that because it is a full-time thing. If you were to pay for it out of pocket, it's about $7,500. It could be a little bit more now because of things like uniform and equipment and things that you have to buy in order to attend. And let me see if this link is still live. I know I probably shouldn't have done it like right now during the middle of our interview, but it should take you again to the actual website where you can look at careers in law enforcement, the different stations, corrections, volunteers, etc. And it can kind of take you through the whole thing. So you could click on careers and it'll take you to their career page, and you can see that they're now hiring deputy sheriff trainees, pre-service and laterals. And it'll show you all the things. And here again, it kind of walks you through. Here's your contact a recruiter, the current job openings, the description, the different videos. Like here's one on the Sheriff's Academy class, the recent Academy class that graduated. But it'll talk about how to jump the wall and different techniques. There's a technique to get over the 6-foot wall. Okay, so hopefully this kind of helps you a little bit, right? So go to these links and look at them as time permits. And when you get out of the academy, typically you're going to go to what they call training. So as I kind of show you a little bit more of the reality of policing, so you're going to go to what they call field training. And not all field training looks exactly like this. This is kind of a basic model with phase 1 with your field training officer. Let's say it's FTOA, and this is the focus. Orientation, you get daily evals, weekly evals, and then an end of phase report. Phase B would be more complex. A lot more things you're going to do, and there's this big training manual that you're going to basically get signed off, and it's with a different FTO. Then you go to phase 3, and it's even more complex, and then back to your very first FTO, or sometimes it's a fourth one, and again it's going to be your final testing phase. But this is kind of what an FTO training thing looks like. When you get into law enforcement, you have what they call perishable skills. And these skills basically consist of a minimum of 12 hours in each, kind of a 2-year period. And of the 12 hours, 4 has to be completed in 3 specific areas. So arrest and control, driver awareness, tactical firearms, or communication. So these are things that you have to do every 2 years. You're going to repeat and get recertified in all of these different aspects. Okay, then they have what they call continuous professional training. So that's different. Perishable skill training, arrest and control, driver training, tactical firearms, communication. Continuous training is going to be 24 or more hours of what they call post-training. It could be a bunch of different things. It could be gangs, it could be narcotics, it could be all sorts of different things, riot control, etc. So that's 24 hours or more of additional training that you're going to have to do every couple years. All right, a couple of the quick federal guidelines when it comes to becoming a law enforcement officer. Understand that there are some occupational qualifications. Okay, BFOQ, bona fide occupational qualification. And that means that all requirements must be clearly listed, right, in the job application. But there are some things to where maybe you won't qualify, okay? And that could be like color blindness. So if you look at these 2 firearms, which one is fake and which one is real? All right, now to add to kind of color blindness, just to kind of show you the issues, showing you which one might be real or which one's fake. What about this? What if you couldn't see that this was a fake gun and it had a red tip? Now, that doesn't mean that criminals couldn't paint an orange or a red tip on a gun or something like that to fool law enforcement, etc. But if you couldn't see that, you could get involved in a lethal force encounter with some kid that had like a fake firearm or a toy gun. So there are some things that are disqualifying. Although, again, remember that, all requirements have to be clearly job related and listed on the application. And color blindness, I put that in there because that tends to be one that comes up. As far as affirmative action goes, signed by President Nixon in 1973, further strengthened the power of the EEOC. Affirmative action refers to the special endeavors by employers to recruit, hire, retain, and promote minority group members and eliminate discrimination. Many agencies are doing a fabulous job on really getting out there and recruiting women and minorities into law enforcement. Okay? And so it's important that we understand that we have these protections that are there. We have the Equal Employment Opportunities Act. In 1964, Congress enacted the Civil Rights Act, if you will. So it's the omnibus civil rights law, of which Title VII concerned employment opportunities and prohibited discrimination based on race, sex, color, religion, national origin. And then you had in 1972, Congress passed the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, which kind of modified Title VII to include all of the state and local units of government, including law enforcement. There's the American with Disabilities Act in 1990. So during an interview, law enforcement can't ask certain medical questions because they can't discriminate based on disability. Now, with that being said, they can set minimum standards that the applicant has to meet because of the job itself. So they won't ask you those medical questions per se on the application, right? Or during the interview, but that will come with the background package or your medical. When you take the medical, you have to be able to perform certain things. And if you can't, then you may not meet that minimum standard for that job. So let's say if you have a disability, let's say it's color blindness, it doesn't mean that you couldn't work perhaps maybe in the jail or in records or in dispatch or something else other than an armed officer in the field, right? So that's the protections that are there for those kinds of things. And then, of course, they have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as it relates to sexual harassment, etc. Okay, and then finally, I talked a little bit earlier about probation. Probationary period is usually it's usually a year. Sometimes departments might have it a little longer. I've heard of it being 18 months or even 16 months, but typically it's a year. And that during that year is where you're going to go through your field training program with your field training officers, and then you'll be on your own after you pass your training program, but you're still on probation to make sure that you're progressing at an acceptable rate, etc. And then once you get off probation, then you're a full-time law enforcement officer off of probation, okay? So just understand the probationary rule. As it relates to retention, and it's important that we talk about this because why is there turnover and things like that? Why do officers leave? Well, it's probably like any other business. Sometimes you have bad bosses. Sometimes the pay isn't enough. Sometimes it's stress and burnout based on a critical incident. And I've seen a lot of officers over the last several years leave their organizations because of burnout, because they were involved in a critical incident, and because of PTSD. And the last couple of years have been really, really difficult years as it relates to law enforcement, suicide, and things like that. So these are all things to consider as you get into policing. And I would highly suggest that if you do get into law enforcement, have friends on the outside. Don't always hang around with everybody on the inside. There's a very It's an interesting law enforcement culture that we've talked about as we've gone through this entire textbook, and all these different chapters that we've discussed. We know there's policing culture, but it also doesn't hurt to have, how do you burn off steam, have other friends other than law enforcement, etc., and do different things, right, to kind of keep your life balanced, if you will. Why do law enforcement agencies have unions? Well, there are some right to work laws. These grant states the authority to basically determine whether workers can be required to join a union or keep their jobs without becoming union members. A lot of organizations I know have unions. It's kind of because of collective bargaining, etc. These are some of the bigger ones: the Fraternal Order of Police, National Association of Police Organizations. But when I worked at Rialto, we had the Rialto Police Department Benefit Association. And it was a great group of individuals that were there to protect you. And I understood that even as a police chief, I know that there's a union to protect the officers, right? Or even non-sworn staff, to make sure that our organization, we're doing the right things and we're watching out for everybody. So, that's really one of the rationales for the unions. Moonlighting. It's kind of an interesting thing, working part-time at a job while fulfilling obligations of a full-time position. There are some standards that are outlined by CALEA, and it can be a source of controversy. Understand that when you get into policing, your policing job is first, and because of that, and because of the type of job that you have, there may be some controversy or some limitations on what job you can do off duty. So for an example, your rules and regulations might prohibit you from wearing your uniform working off-duty security at some other event, etc. And so you can't represent the organization, but you can be on your own, etc. And usually it's from department to department on how that actually works. I talked a little bit about accreditation. There are some organizations, typically a lot of these are back east, but it's starting to kind of move this way a little bit, where organizations actually get some type of accreditation. So the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, considered the gold standard in public safety. There are 5 different phases, and there are departments throughout the U.S. that have this certification. A lot of departments in California may not be CALEA certified because they basically are recognized, or they're under the kind of guise or leadership, etc., of POST, Peace Officer Standards and Training. So a lot of them go that way instead of getting a separate certification. Some of the benefits to CALEA could be accountability, reduced liability, stronger defense against lawsuits, increased community advocacy, etc. Okay, and then as we kind of finish up, just understanding a little bit more about, police professionalism, etc. And it's important that we understand this because, law enforcement is a profession, right? And these are things that, we've worked hard in order to kind of gain our profession, if you will. So the most notable advancement in the field of policing really has been the professionalism of police officers. And this is partly because 80 to 90% of most police agencies' budgets, which we saw, are allocated for personnel. Therefore, agencies are demanding higher quality performance of their officers, and that's expected. And this is, sometimes difficult to obtain. However, many departments are understaffed. And the attrition rate throughout the U.S., approximately 100,000 officers, per year, doesn't help, right? It compounds the problem and creates this constant demand for training. In fact, training and education are so vital to the success of policing that together they compromise one of the 6 foundational pillars that were outlined by that president's task force on 21st century policing that I showed you in 2015. Now, equally important force behind the professionalization of police officers is the realization that, to a large degree, the future success of law enforcement is contingent on its police officers' quality and effectiveness, their status in the community, and their ability to serve the community's residents. I kind of talked about that. So, and throughout this lecture and throughout the textbook, policing has been referred to as a profession. However, whether law enforcement technically qualifies as a profession, some say it is and some say it don't. I certainly do say it does. Okay, that we do qualify. And some of the elements of professionalism include things like specialized knowledge. The time when someone could walk into a police department, fill out an application, and get hired is gone. And although, again, a little bit of college has been advocated for a long time, many organizations now require maybe 60 units or maybe even a 2-year degree in order to get hired. So you being in class now and hopefully going for that 2-year degree in criminal justice or whatever it is kind of your first step. So it's really important that you're doing that. Next will be autonomy. Professional autonomy refers to the ability to control entrance into the profession, to define the content of the knowledge to be obtained, and to be responsible for self-monitoring and disciplining. In addition to the autonomy, of a profession is usually authorized by the power of the state. For example, physicians, dentists, lawyers, etc., right? And teachers, they're licensed by the state. And these professions are, in effect, it's a level of autonomy, right? And for California, it's going to be set through the Peace Officer Standards and Training, so POST. And then finally, the last point would be the service ideal. The third element of a profession. A service ideal requires that members of the profession follow a formal code of ethics, and we have this in law enforcement, and be committed to serving the community. And in this area, police officers qualify as professionals, provided the department stresses, that public servant aspect of police work. So a lot of information. And then finally, just to kind of leave you with something, you can look this up. We've talked about it or we've seen it in a couple of our other lectures. But, we talked about technology, etc. One of the things that I feel I've contributed to the profession, to that law enforcement profession, would be the advent of body cameras. And the Rialto Police Department, in conjunction with Cambridge University in England, we did conduct the very first randomized control trial in the world, not the US, in the world, as it relates to the effectiveness of body-worn video cameras being worn by officers, specifically to address things like use of force and officer complaints. So check that out. I think you'll be fascinated. And with that being said, that's going to wrap up our lecture on how to become a law enforcement officer. Don't forget to go to the POST website. Take a look at some of these documents that I showed you. The personal history statement, right? The different sheriff's websites that you can go to. And I even have in here, if you go, and I think it's inside of your course Canvas, I've also posted kind of a basic, this is the POST entry level test. It's not the actual test, it's kind of a guide. And it'll walk you through a little bit of some of the questions on how they're formatted, etc., for your police officer entry test in California. So again, I hope this really helps. And with that being said, that's going to conclude our final lecture on becoming a police professional.